Here's Pat Foran and a consumer alert. Pat.
Now, you might have seen this news on CTV News recently about this family and the very large tax bill they received on their parents' estate. We're going to step through this just to see what triggered this, whether they should have expected it, and what they could have done to prevent paying over $600,000 in taxes.
Thanks, Michelle and Natalie. A Burlington husband and wife saved throughout their lives in RRSPs with thoughts of leaving the money to their children. But when they both died in the same year, the family was shocked to get a final tax bill of more than $600,000.
So let's start there. If your intention is to leave money to your children, then RSPs can be used for that purpose. Certainly, you can have money in there that's going to go to your children. You can name them as beneficiaries or what have you. However, you're going to find out about the inherent problem with that approach, and that proper estate planning would allow for what they're about to experience.
Last year was a difficult time for Ashley Galley and her Burlington family. Her mother, Jackie, who worked as a nurse, died in January at 62 years old. And in December, her father, Michael, who worked in business, passed suddenly at 63.
Okay, so this is where the problem begins. Uh, these folks, unfortunately, tragically, both of the parents died when they were still relatively young in their 60s. That's not at all what RSPs are designed for or designed around. And so it's a big tax risk of RRSPs.
The couple were high school sweethearts.
We think that my dad passed away of a broken heart.
Gallia describes her parents as hard workers who saved to buy a cottage in 1998 and always put money away in their RRSPs for their retirement. 5 years ago, they sold their home and made the cottage their principal residence. When they both died last year, Gallia's mother's RRSP rolled into her father's for a total of $715,000. When her father died, the RRSP had to be taxed as income at about 50%, and there was capital gains on the cottage. The family had a tax bill of $659,000.
Okay, so we don't have all the details here, but one of the things, well, there's two things going on here that are causing this big tax bomb. One is the second party of the couple passed away. So when the first party passes away, when the mom passed away, her RSP would have just rolled over into the dad's RRSP. However, without any tax event. However, when he passed away, now there's tax owing on that amount, which they say there was over $700,000 in that RRSP. That's just going to be taxed as income in the year that he passed away, which means a lot of that money is going to roll up into what we call the highest tax bracket, highest marginal tax rate, which in Ontario would be around 53% or so. On top of that, it sounds like their cottage, which they had moved into and that had become their primary residence, they didn't do any kind of a change in status of that property when they did that. Quite possibly they didn't have to. The increase in the value of that cottage from the time that they either built or acquired that cottage up to the time they moved into it and took over as their principal residence, that amount, which could easily be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars if they'd had the cottage a long time, that was taxable as a capital gain. Once they moved into it and it became their primary residence, any growth after that would not have been taxable. So it sounds like they didn't pay the taxes that were owing on this previously, which they may well not have had to.
It made me more angry than anything. We've just lost both of our parents inside of 11 months.
Gallia says to avoid selling the cottage, almost the entire amount of RRSPs her parents saved had to go to pay the tax bill.
Okay, so without planning for this big tax liability that was going to come at some time on this cottage, it put the inheritance or the heirs to this in the position of either having to sell the cottage to pay the taxes, or if they wanted to keep the cottage, they had to pay the taxes. So the source of cash they used to pay the taxes was the RRSP. Now they were losing, let's say, close to half of the value of the RRSP to taxes because that became income in the year that the father passed away. So that was cut in half, and then the residue from that was used to pay the taxes, the tax bill on the property, the capital gain on the cottage. Something to bear in mind, the capital gain is only, the taxable portion is only 50% of the gain. So if they were paying somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's call it $300,000 in taxes on the cottage, again, all of this is happening in the tax year that the person passed away in. So you've got this massive RSP of $700,000 plus the capital gain of the cottage all coming into their income in the last year. So just ballparking, I'm guessing the capital gain on that cottage was probably well over $1 million. Normally, or with good planning, if your intention is for the cottage to remain in the family, because often it has deep family sentimental value, you need to make a plan for that. Sometimes people use life insurance. There's other ways of addressing that.
She says she and her brother expected some of the funds and were shocked almost nothing was left over.
What happens to the RRSP? Maybe there's a better vessel to put that in so that it does pass on to your kids or who you'd like it to pass to.
If you wanted
Yes, that's possible. There may well be a better way to treat, but all that requires planning. And what we're fond of saying is you need to start out as you intend to go. So, for example, if you're just piling money into an RRSP, that may or may not be a good idea depending on your situation, but you need to be making plans for down the road of what's going to happen with that tax bill. And there are two timings for taxation on RRSPs. One is when you withdraw the money, and you may just withdraw that money and use it as income. You are compelled to withdraw that money as income once you reach age 71. And so once you start withdrawing that money, it is going to be taxed. However, when you pass away, it's all going to be taxed at once. And what you'll find is if you're withdrawing money from your RRSP at the prescribed rate, the RIF prescribed rate, starting at age 71, by the time you get to life expectancy, mid 80s, 86, let's say, if your money's reasonably well invested in your RRSP, you won't actually have reduced the amount that's in that RRSP by that much. So, let's say, just as a simple example, you've got it invested in something and you're getting 5% growth in your RRSP and you're compelled to withdraw 5% a year. Well, the capital, the actual nest egg in your RRSP isn't really diminishing. And it takes a fair while until you get into your mid 80s, until that is really going to start to happen more rapidly. So you've got these two risks on your RRSP. One is that you are going to pay tax on it when you're taking it and you're compelled to take it as income. But you have this much bigger estate risk on your RRSP when you pass away. And in this case, tragically, these two people died long before they even started drawing the money. Now, they're kind of vilifying the RRSP here by saying all of the RRSP got eaten up by all of the taxes. But what they're really not talking too much about is the tax bill on the cottage, which is a separate issue. It just happens that it sounds like the cash that was available to deal with paying the taxes on the cottage was the money in the RRSP. So take 50% away from the RRSP in taxes, and then take another 50% because they had to use all that to pay the tax on the cottage, and that's it. However, they were left with the cottage as an asset worth maybe, who knows how much, $1 to $2 million, maybe more. It really depends on the circumstances. And yes, it's an unhappy outcome, and it's shocking to see that amount of tax being paid, but it's no mystery. However, there are ways to plan around this.
do some retirement income planning for tax efficiency, at least by the age of 55 or 60.
I would even say that you want to do that well before that age, because if you've accumulated a big pile of money in your RRSP by the time you're 60, uh, or you're heading to retirement, um, you're starting to get limited in your ability to manage that. Now, there are some great strategies for reducing the liability on the taxes, but they do require that you remain alive. And I don't mean to make light of these people's tragic situation, but that is a real risk of RRSPs. And so I would argue that really you want to be making that plan when you're accumulating your money. Because if you've accumulated a bunch of money inside an RRSP, there are definitely strategies. We work with people all the time to implement them to get money out of the RRSPs and reduce and limit the tax liability, both as income and on the estate. But they take time, and you're still going to pay some taxes. You might have been able to have less tax liability if you'd gone down a different path.
Tax expert Evelyn Jack says families should adopt a strategy to reduce the amount of tax they pay, use life insurance, and get advice from a professional to avoid a massive tax bill when a loved one passes.
Now, using life insurance, definitely a great strategy in some situations. We do it, again, quite regularly with our clients. And in this case, you've got two distinctive tax liabilities, one of which is uncertain. You don't know how much tax is going to be owing on the RRSP when the second person in the couple passes away, because you don't know when that's going to happen. In this case, it happened prematurely, and so there was a big tax bill. And just as well, $700,000, there was taxable income of $700,000. So for the cottage, though, that's more of a known quantity, especially because they moved into the cottage and took it over as their principal residence. So they actually had a known tax liability that was going to have to be paid sometime in the future when there was a disposition, a sale, or a deemed disposition, which is what happens when you pass away. The government deems that your assets have all been sold on the day that you died. And so that deemed disposition happened on the day that the father passed away, and the taxes on the cottage became owing. None of this, including the taxes on the RSP, were a mystery, in the sense that it's widely known, it's not some secret gotcha. However, when we go to the bank, which is where most people unfortunately go to get their financial investments, they're not really getting advice. Even the people who go into the very comfy offices, that would be people who have $500,000 or $1 million or more in assets. Those people aren't really getting much advice either. And if you're not certain about that, talk to us. I can give you all sorts of evidence of that. What they're getting is they're getting sold products, and usually not much long range planning. And so even had they been, and maybe they were dealing with advisors like that, they were not well advised, either because they didn't seek advice, quite possible, or they were just dealing with glorified salespeople inside the banking system. And so no plans were put in place. If they'd been working with any kind of a financial advisor worth their salt, they should absolutely have been planning for the tax liabilities both during the income phase and during for their estate. In this case, it appears none of that happened.
Take a tax hit earlier on so they can avoid a top marginal tax rate at death. And in the process, put that money into more tax efficient vehicles, for example, a TFSA.
Gallia says she's still grieving the loss of her parents, but wanted to share what happened to her family to help others.
Other people learn that maybe RRSPs aren't the best option for them, then at least I've done something to be helpful or beneficial, and I think my parents would be proud of me for that.
So the question lurking under here that the media won't really dig into is, who was giving them advice? Where was their RRSP held? Because their RRSP obviously had grown substantially. They had some investments in it. They were getting advice, or supposedly getting advice, somewhere. And on top of that, did they have an accountant? They should have an accountant who's asking them questions. The accountant can't solve their retirement income and estate planning problems for them, but the accountant can ask questions and say, well, what's going to happen with this and how are we going to manage that? The estate planning process really stands on three pillars. You're getting legal advice, which means first and foremost having a will, but getting legal advice about different strategies. You're working with an accountant who's going to help you understand your future liabilities and look at plans and assess them for that future from an accounting point of view and a tax liability point of view, and staying on side with CRA. And finally, a financial advisor. And the financial advisor is usually, if they're good, going to actually have a team they're working with. So there's people who are doing planning, there's people who are doing investments, and there are people who deal with life insurance, where that fits in with an estate plan. Unfortunately, most people don't get that fully fleshed out type of advice, which is what you absolutely need to make a complete financial plan. So, for example, in this case, we've worked with clients in similar situations, even when their estates, I'm going to guess that the net worth of those folks was, who knows, $3-4 million, might have been a little less. But even with clients who only have a net worth of 500,000 to $1 million, we've put together plans for them where most recently we've reduced the tax liability by about $450,000 over their retirement projections, so that they're going to pay less tax, significantly less tax on their income in retirement, which means they have more money to spend, and then they're going to pay much less tax on their estate when they pass away. And so all of that just requires planning. There's different tools we use for that, whether it's RSP meltdown strategies or life insurance or all sorts of other things. Our goal is always, and this should be your goal in planning, to optimize around how much money you're going to have to spend in retirement, how much money is going to be left in your estate, and how much tax you're going to pay in both those phases. On top of that, you have to have an investment strategy that aligns with all those things, including aligning with your particular temperament and tolerance for investment risk in investment planning.